Hi, everyone. Welcome back to dinanddaf. This is Elana Stein Hain, and today we are going to talk about where kedusha, holiness, comes from, specifically where the kedusha of Yerushalayim, Jerusalem, and where the kedusha of Eretz Yisrael, the whole land of Israel, comes from. It's actually brought up in the Gemara in Zevachim, Daf Samech Amud Bet, 60b, where the conversation is about Rabbi Yishmael thinking that when there is no brick and mortar Beit HaMikdash, there is no brick and mortar temple, that you no longer can bring the Bechor Behema Tahura, the firstborn kosher animal, as an offering, and you also can no longer eat Maser Sheni, the secondary tithe, in Jerusalem's precincts. Sounds like you need a Beit HaMikdash for the kedusha, for the sanctity that allows for those sacrifices to happen and for that secondary tithes to be eaten in Jerusalem. There needs to be kedusha. And in that context, the Gemara asks, well, what does Rabbi Yishmael think? Does Rabbi Yishmael think kedusha rishona kidsha l'shata v'kidsha la'atid lavo? Does he think that the original kedusha, and I think we could safely say the original kedusha, at least in the time of Shlomo, right, King Solomon, sanctifying the temple, that it continues to have sanctity, even though, and Yerushalayim continues to have sanctity, even though there's no longer a temple? Or does Rabbi Yishmael think, lo kidsha la'atid lavo, it no longer has sanctity once it's not there? And I think by implication, it sounds like there would be the same question about the creation of the Beit HaMikdash in Ezra's time, right? Beit HaMikdash, you sanctify it. Is there still a sanctity even after the Beit HaMikdash is destroyed, right? So the question here really is, essentially, is the first time the Beit HaMikdash built by Shlomo and consecrated, is it now forever that Jerusalem has this kedusha, has this holiness that implicates lots of different things, right? It implicates what sacrifices you can give and have to give. It implicates the ability to give sacrifices at all. Forget it. It implicates whether you can eat the secondary tithe there. It implicates people in terms of purity and impurity, where they're allowed to go. So it turns out, it seems, at least at face value, that there may even be a machloket about this question in the Mishnah in Eduyot. The truth is, the Gemara in Megillah deals with this Mishnah and ends up saying it's not a machloket, but nonetheless, an opinion that's here is very important. And it goes as follows. Amar Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer says, Shamati, I heard, Kishayu Bonim Behechal, when they were building the Kodesh, right? They were building the holy in Yerushalayim in the time of Ezra, second Beit HaMikdash. Osim klaim lahechal klaim la'azarot. They would make, usually you would have walls to these places once the Mikdash was up. They would put up curtains to these places, meaning give them temporary walls, quote unquote. Ela shebehechal bonim mibachutz uba'azara bonim mibifnim. Right? So when they were building in the holy and they were trying to put up temporary curtains, they would put them up standing outside, right? And when they were putting up the temporary curtains in other places, the big courtyards or the big court, they could stand from the inside. But the point here seems to be, at least at face value, Rabbi Eliezer is saying, if you want to be able to have this Mikdash, this temple function, even as you're building it, you actually have to have some, if not brick and mortar, at least curtains, right? Now, that sounds like the kedusha was not there until you actually sanctify it and rebuild it. But Rabbi Yoshua says, Shamati, I heard, Shemakrivin afal pi she'ein bayit, that you can give korbanot, sacrifices, even though there's no Beit HaMikdash, there's no temple, no brick and mortar. I would say not only that, no curtains even, right? Ve'ochlim kodshe kadashim, afal pishein klaim. You can eat the higher status korbanot that you're supposed to eat within the holy. You can eat them even without any physical markers. There's no curtain, there's no wall. Kachim kalim u'maser sheni, and you can eat the lower holiness status of korbanot, which you're allowed to eat anywhere in Yerushalayim, and secondary tithes. Afal pi she'ein choma, you can eat them even though there's no wall around Jerusalem. Why? Shekedusha rishona kidsha l'shata, the kidsha latid lavo. Because even the original kedusha that this place got, that Yerushalayim got, as a result of Shlomo building the temple there, building the Mikdash there, that obtains even after the temple is destroyed. So that original first time, nobody needs to redo anything in the time of Ezra in the sense of consecrating officially. So people explain that some of the things you see in Ezra and Nehemiah that look like they're consecrating was actually sort of just as like a symbolic act, but they didn't actually need to consecrate it. It was already kadosh. And some people interpret that what Rabbi Eliezer was saying about the need to put up curtains indicates that you actually do need some sort of physical structure for the kedusha. Now, the Gemara in Megillah ends up saying Rabbi Eliezer doesn't really disagree with Rabbi Yoshua. Everybody agrees that the original kedusha from the time of Shlomo actually continues to obtain. So sounds like we've resolved the machloket, at least from that perspective. And kedusha rishona kidsha l'sha'ata v'kidsha latid lavo. The original kedusha works in its time and works forever through having no Beit HaMikdash in between the first and the second, through the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash, and on and on and on. Yerushalayim retains its kedusha forever. Now, I have to tell you what's interesting about this is that this is very different from a parallel machloket, a parallel argument about not Kedushat Yerushalayim, but Kedushat Eretz Yisrael, the sanctity of the land of Israel as a whole. Now, when we talk about the sanctity of the land of Israel as a whole, the kind of halachic things we're talking about are not korbanot, but the kind of halachic things we're talking about are the requirement for tithing, for example, right? There are certain halachic requirements if there is kedusha on the land. Now, I want to put a little bit of an asterisk in that because there may be other variables that are important for whether you have to tithe or not tithe, and kedusha might not be the only variable. You could actually have Eretz Yisrael be kedusha, but still not biblically have to give maaser, have to give tithing, because that may be dependent on an additional variable, and therefore it might only be D'Rabbanan today. But we'll get to that when we get to that. But first things first, I just want us to see that Rav Ovadia bar Tenura already regarding that Mishnah in Edio, where this concept of Kedusha Rishona Kidsha L'Shata V'Kidsha L'Atid Lavo, the original Kedusha of Yerushalayim obtains even without a Beit HaMikdash. He points out, he says, Aval, however, Kedushat Shar Eretz Yisrael, but the Kedusha of the rest of the land of Israel, Lo Kidsha B'Kibush Rishon Ela L'Shata. When you think about what was the Kedusha Rishona, the original sanctity of Eretz Yisrael, when the Jewish people sanctified it as a place of covenant, it was in the time of Yehoshua, it was in the time of Joshua. When they left Egypt, went through the desert, Moshe didn't get to go into Eretz Yisrael, Yehoshua takes them into Eretz Yisrael, and what do? Essentially, kibush. They conquer it militarily. So says Rabbi Ovadia bar Tenura, I want you to know that Kedusha Rishona of Eretz Yisrael, that only worked l'sha'ata. It only worked when the Jewish people were still there in ownership of the land, right? Not once they were exiled. Then the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael, even if the Kedusha of Yerushalayim stays, the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael dissipates. Ad shechazru olei Bavel, until those who came up ascended from Babylon, right? We're talking about the time of Zerubbabel and then Ezra and Nehemiah. When they came back, the Kedusha Shnia, and they sanctified it a second time. That Va'ota Kedusha, that Kedusha, Kidsha Latid Lavo, that stays forever, that Kedusha. wow, interesting. So what we have here is sort of different split screen. On the one side, you talk about the Kedusha of Yerushalayim, and it seems that the original Kedusha of Yerushalayim with King Shlomo building the Beit HaMikdash obtains forever, even when the Beit HaMikdash is destroyed. But on the other hand, when you're talking about Kedushat Eretz Yisrael, it seems that the original Kedushat Eretz Yisrael, which was reflected in the Israelites conquering the land, actually dissipates once they get exiled, and it's only the second Kedusha, the second consecration, when they return from Babylon, when King Cyrus gives them the possibility to return, that actually lasts, whether there's a Mikdash or not, whether Jews get kicked out of the land or not, that Kedusha remains. Now, where is Rav Ovadia Bartenura getting that from? A whole bunch of places. One is the Gemara in Chagiga, Daf Gimel Amud Bet, and the Gemara in Chagiga talks about, Ammon and Moab, which is on the east side of the Jordan, which certainly, as I reviewed with my kid for his test on Parshat Devarim, certainly we know that there were sections of Ammon and Moab that were conquered by Ole Mitzrayim. They were conquered by the Jews coming out of Egypt, the east side of the Jordan. So during that conquest time, and while the Jews remained there, that had Kedusha. But once they were kicked out of that area, it no longer had Kedusha. And so the Gemara in Chagiga is talking about the way that we think of that area east of the Jordan now, quote unquote, meaning now in their time. And they basically say it's a place where Shemitah doesn't apply. The sabbatical year doesn't apply. Why would it apply? Even if Jews are living there, they don't have, they didn't actually conquer that area. Certainly in the time of Ezra, when they came back, they didn't settle there. So that's not a place that they actually took over. So it doesn't have the status of Eretz Yisrael. And there are other places as well. But one place that I really want to point to, and I think it's really significant, is you have a Braita that's cited as being from Seder Olam, which is basically a rabbinic collection that gives you the chronology of the world from its beginnings. And this Braita from Seder Olam, which is quoted in Yevamot Pei Bet Amud Bet, says the following: Titania of Seder Olam, it's taught in a Braita of Seder Olam, it's Seder Olam, quoting from towards the end of the book of Devarim, Asher Yarshu Avotecha Virishta, right? That which your fathers inherited, and you shall inherit it, right? Now, obviously, the word Yerusha is used here twice, right? And so what's understood from this is Yerusha, Rishona, Ushnia. There will be two inheritances of the land, right? So Yerusha, Rishona, Ushnia, Yesh Lahen. There are two inheritances of the land, meaning the first inheritance is not going to be enough, meaning the time of Yehoshua, when they conquer the land, is not going to be enough to maintain that inheritance for the Jewish people. Once we're kicked out, once we're exiled, we no longer have say over it. But then you have a Yerusha Shnia, a second inheritance coming back in the time of Ezra. And that's all you need. Shlishit en lahen, you don't need a third, meaning the residual effect of Ole Bavel, of Zerubbabel, Ezra, Nehemiah, Cyrus giving them back the land, or I should say, Cyrus giving them permission to live in the land, to live in the land of Israel. That is the Yerusha Shnia, the second inheritance, and it gives the land Kedusha that lasts even after the Beit HaMikdash is destroyed, right? Now, the Rambam in classic form gives us both of these sides of the screen. Yerushalayim's Kedusha is original from Shlomo, and whereas the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael is actually Dafka specifically from Ezra, He gives this to us in a programmatic statement. Now, this is in the Mishnah Torah, the laws of the Beit HaBechira, the chosen home, meaning the Beit HaMikdash. Says, uh, uh, I think I'm going to skip even to Halakha Ted Vav. Okay, this is Hilchot Beit Bechira, Perek Vav, Halakha Ted Vav, where he says because the kedusha of Yerushalayim obtains no matter what, he says Lefichach makrivina korbanot kulan afal pi she'en sham bayit banui. Therefore, you can give it korbanot even if there's no actual brick and mortar building of the temple standing. You can eat the highest version of sacrificial meat, of sacrifices in what would have been the temple precincts, even though there is no physical temple, ve'ena mukefet b'machitza, even though there's no wall around it. V'ochlim kachim kalim u'maser shein v'chol Yerushalayim. You can eat the lesser form of holy korbanot and secondary tithes in all of Jerusalem. Afal b'shein sham chomot, even if there's no delineating walls. Why? Shakidusha rishona kitcha l'shata. Because the original kedusha in the time of Shlomo lasts forever. Okay, Yerushalayim always kedusha. And then he says, I know what you're thinking. Velama ani omer b'mikdash v'Yerushalayim kedusha rishona kitchalati lavo. Why do I say that when it comes to the temple and Jerusalem, that the original sanctification in the time of Shlomo obtains forever? Whereas Kedushat Eretz Yisrael, and when it comes to the rest of the land of Israel, le'inyan shvit, in terms of whether the sabbatical year is applies, umasrot and tithing, b'kayotze behen, and things like that. Lo kitchalati lavo. I don't think it's the original kedusha that lasts throughout, but instead it's only the kedusha of the Olei Bavel, of the time of Ezra, when it becomes something that will apply for all time from then on. Why wasn't the original kedusha of the Olei Mitzrayim good enough? Lefisha kedushat Mikdash v'Yerushalayim, because the holiness, the sanctification of the temple and Jerusalem are mipnei hashchina, are because of the divine presence. Ushchina eina betela. And nobody can nullify the divine presence. Once the divine presence has been invited and it's there, it's there. Now, it's interesting because when you look in the book of Yechezkel, for example, you do actually see Yechezkel telling the people that God is removing God's Shekhinah from that area. But that's not where the Rambam is, okay? God's Shekhinah eina betela. It doesn't leave. V'harehu omer, and even God says, V'hashimoti et mikdashechem, I will destroy your mikdash, or really your holy places. Ve'amru chachamim, and the rabbis say, Af al pi sheshomimin, even though they are v'hashimoti, even though they are desolate, b'kedushatan heim omdim, they are still in their kedusha, they're still in their status of holiness. That's Jerusalem. But the requirement to keep the sabbatical year and to tithe in Eretz Yisrael, eino ela mipnei shehu kibush rabim. That is because it is the conquest of the masses. Meaning in the time of Yehoshua, the conquest of the masses. Eretz Yisrael was conquered by the masses of Israelites. But once the land was taken away from them, batel kibush, their conquest was nullified. V'niftara min haTorah mimasrot umishviit sharei ena min Eretz Yisrael. And biblically speaking, they no longer had to give tithes, no longer had to do the sabbatical year, because biblically, this is no longer Eretz Yisrael, right? If the only way you get access to this place is through military conquest, once somebody else conquers it and kicks you out, it's done. But then what about in the time of Ezra? V'kevan she'ala Ezra, but when Ezra came, remember this is Cyrus the Great giving permission, v'kidsha, and he sanctified Eretz Yisrael, lo kidsha b'kibush, he didn't sanctify it through military conquest, ela b'chazaka, but rather through just living there. Shechaziku ba, meaning, what do we say in what's a chazaka? A chazaka is you live somewhere for 3 years and people let you live there, right? Like people let you live there. They lived there, meaning Cyrus gave them permission to go. They didn't conquer it from somebody. Cyrus gave them permission to go. They went. They lived there. Ulafichach, and therefore, kol makom shechziku ba olei bavel, any place that they took control over, right? In this way of just by living there. Vinit kadesh b'kedushat Ezra hashni'ah, and those places that were consecrated by Ezra in this kedusha shnia, a secondary kedusha, not the original kedusha from the time of Yoshua. Umekudash hayom, it's still holy today, says the Rambam in his time. V'af al pi shenilkach haaretz mimenu, even though the land was taken from us. B'chayav b'shvi'it u'masrot, and they're required in sabbatical, keep the sabbatical year and to give tithes. Al derech shebe'arnu b'hilchot truma, in the manner that we explained in the laws of truma, which I give you a little gift on the bottom of this source sheet, which is you just know that the Rambam thinks that still the halachot of maser still only apply midrabanan because not everybody, not all of the Jews, he says in his time, lived there, and that might be a requirement, and it's not just about whether there's kedusha. But leave that as it may. He's trying to explain to us, well, I got to tell you, Olei Mitzrayim, the time of Yoshua, it was conquered. That's how the Israelites, that's how the Jews got it. And once somebody else conquers it, our hold on it is gone. The kedusha is gone. But Olei Bavel, but the people came up from Babylon under the Persian king Cyrus with Ezra. Those people, that was a chazaka. They got it not by military conquest. They were given it. They sat there. They lived there. And that kedusha lasts. Now, why? Why one over the other? I understand, I guess, why kibush, you conquer it and somebody else conquers it. So it's a ping pong ball. You conquered it and then somebody else conquers it. But I don't understand why chazaka works any better. So there are a few different explanations. One is an explanation from the Even HaEzel, one of those mefarshim on the Rambam, one of those commentators on the Rambam, that he says it's actually about how they got it to begin with. Okay? They get it to begin with instead of it belonging to somebody else, and then they have to conquer it. They get it to begin with. It was hefker to begin with. It was ownerless to begin with. Now you might say, how is it hefker to begin with? Cyrus owns the land and says it's hefker. You can take it, right? So the zeh muchach midivrei Rambam, he says the chazaka adif mikibush le'inyan zeh. He says chazaka seems to be a more enduring form than military victory or military conquest. Because if you conquer someplace through military conquest, somebody else's military conquest can take it out of your hands. But when the Jewish people got something in the time of King Cyrus, Michel Hefker, something that was ownerless, right, as only King Cyrus could render it, right? Lo mahani kibush milchama lo tzimi de Yisrael. There's no reason why somebody conquering it from us takes it out of our hands, because the way we got it in the first place is through a different kind of not land grab, but a different kind of shaychut, a different kind of belonging to the land. So really, really interesting. The idea that when it comes to military conquest, it's just a ping pong game. But if there actually is a place or a space that is considered tabula rasa, that is considered just a blank canvas, then your hold on it becomes much more enduring. Okay? That's Even HaEzel. Now, the Eretz Yisrael, in his Perush Yachin on um, Eduyot, that first Mishnah that we looked at, even though that Mishnah was about Yerushalayim and its kedusha, he brings up this issue as well. And he actually thinks it's not about how the Jews got it in the time of Ezra, but it's about how the destruction happened in each of the Batei Mikdash. He says, Demidelo hitnabe navi beferush. Since in the time of the Second Temple, there was no prophet who explicitly prophesied sheyachzeru akum v'yitlu mehem, that the Gentiles would come and take Eretz Yisrael from them, the way there was in the first Beit HaMikdash, right? You had all these, you had all the Trasar, you had Yeshayahu, you had Yirmiyahu, you had Yechezkel, right? I mean, there are plenty of people saying they are going to take it from you. But because in the time of the second Beit HaMikdash, which was created in the time of Ezra, they never had such prophecy. Lo ata kibush akum u'mevatel chazaka didan. The military conquest by the Romans doesn't destroy our chazaka, our hold on the land. It's great. Meaning, he's basically saying we never had any religious messaging that we would lose connection to this land. So yeah, we did lose connection to this land, and people destroyed us, and people would, but we're still connected. We're still connected, and the kedusha still obtains. So that's another opinion. I want to end with Rav Yosef Soloveitchik's opinion because it is amazing. He's like, don't talk to me about kibush versus chazaka, where kibush is the more temporary and chazaka is the more. No, 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 you are missing the point altogether. He says, what I want to think about is when the Israelites first came to Canaan in the time of Yoshua, what were they engaged with first? Eretz Yisrael or Yerushalayim? Clearly, Eretz Yisrael, right? It was a force. They were coming from the outside and they were moving in to Yerushalayim. When the Jewish people came from Bavel, what did they start with? Yerushalayim. And then they settle all around in an outward manner. So he says, when Maimonides speaks of the possession with which the returnees from Babylon possessed the land, where did this occur? Not on the peripheries, but first of all, right in the center, in Jerusalem. How was the land sanctified in the days of Ezra? By right of possession? Possession itself doesn't bring any sanctification. When the holy temple, the chosen dwelling place for the Shekhinah, was built, it bestowed sanctity on the whole land of Israel. This time, the sanctification did not gravitate inward from the circumference, from the outer peripheries to the center. Quite the contrary. The sanctity was established first in the center itself, and from there it spread outward, like a fountain gushing forth, overflowing into the Jerusalem environs, and from thence to the rest of the land of Israel, until all of it was completely sanctified. That which sanctified the land of Israel in Ezra's day was the temple, the Mikdash, the dwelling place of the Shekhinah, the divine presence. This is why Maimonides ruled that the sanctification of the land by Ezra was in the same category as that of the temple, whose sanctification by Solomon was not terminated because the Shekhinah cannot be withdrawn. In plain English, the sanctity of the Mikdash of Yerushalayim is sanctity that does not disappear. In the time of Joshua, the Jewish people sanctified, the Israelites sanctified the land as they went through and conquered it. Eventually, Shlomo sanctified Yerushalayim by building a Beit HaMikdash. Once somebody else takes over the land loses its kedusha because it only happened through some possession, military possession, right? Military conquest, I should say. Whereas the kedusha of Yerushalayim remains because it's the divine presence there. In the time of Bavel, Olei Bavel, in the time of Ezra, in the second Beit HaMikdash, the second temple, when they come back, where do they go first? They go to the temple. They go to rebuild the Mizbeach. They go to rebuild the altar. They go to Yerushalayim. And all of the kedusha that's created through their possession of the land in that time starts in the place where kedusha doesn't dissipate, Yerushalayim, and it moves outwards from there. And that, says Rabbi Soloveitchik, is the reason why the kedusha from the time of the people who came back with Ezra obtains even after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. Because ultimately, or I should say, obtains even after the destruction, even after the exile from the land. Because the land of Eretz Yisrael gets its kedusha in the time of Ezra through the place of the temple, which is a place where kedusha doesn't get lost. Now, if you want to think big thinking here, what this has given us is it's given us a sense of the permanence of divine presence, but the transience of human conquest. It's given us a conversation about the difference between the ping pong game of war and the ability to connect with a place that actually has no ownership over it. These are fascinating, fascinating concepts, and it does not surprise me that these concepts dafka come up around the concept of kedusha, of designation, given the fact that the world is a place overrun with humans. How you could designate any particular space permanently as anything, given how many humans there are in the world, and people dying and people living in geopolitics and da. It is fascinating to see the Rambam insisting, and I would say Rav Soloveitchik doubling down, that Shechina is what's permanent. And the other stuff comes and goes. But Shechina is what's permanent. Something very, very humbling about that. Very, very humbling. Thanks, everyone. Looking forward to next time.